The Song of Survival. Elaine stood at the edge of the bustling city square, the early morning sun casting a muted glow over the towering buildings. She tightened her coat around her slender frame, the fabric worn thin from years of use. The cold nipped at her skin, a constant reminder of the harshness of her reality. In her hands, she clutched an old, scuffed guitar, the only tangible legacy from her father, a man who had once been her pillar of strength before fate cruelly took him away. The square was alive with movement. People shuffled past in hurried strides, clutching briefcases and steaming cups of coffee, their faces etched with the day's burdens. Elaine felt invisible, a ghost among the crowd. She found her usual spot near the corner, where the cobblestones were uneven and the noise from the nearby traffic created a natural stage. Taking a deep breath, she set her guitar case on the ground and flipped it open. The few coins that clinked at the bottom were a cruel reminder of yesterday's meager earnings. As she positioned herself, her fingers trembled, not from the cold but from the weight of her circumstances. The eviction notice was still fresh in her mind, its sharp yellow paper and bold black letters a stark proclamation of her family's despair. They were out of options, and as the eldest, the responsibility of finding a solution rested heavily on her. Elaine was no stranger to struggle, but this time, the odds felt insurmountable. She strummed the first chord, her fingers moving instinctively over the strings. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, as if the guitar itself understood her reluctance to face the crowd. Then she began to sing. Her voice was rich and soulful, weaving a story of hope and resilience that seemed to float above the noise of the city. The lyrics spoke of hardship, but also of the determination to rise above it. The melody was simple yet profound, each note carrying the weight of her emotions. At first, people hurried past without a second glance. The city was a harsh audience, too preoccupied with its own chaos to notice the girl in tattered clothes singing her heart out. Elaine fought the creeping doubt that threatened to choke her voice. She closed her eyes, focusing on the music, letting it be her refuge. But then, a small moment of connection broke through the indifference. A child tugged at his mother's coat, pointing toward Elaine with wide, curious eyes. The mother hesitated, her expression softening as she allowed the boy to listen. Elaine noticed and offered a faint smile, her voice gaining strength from the child's innocent attention. For every encouraging moment, there were also cruel ones. A man in a sharp business suit stopped briefly, his face twisted in disdain. "Why don't you get a real job instead of begging?" he sneered, his words cutting through her song like a blade. Elaine faltered, her voice wavering as embarrassment flushed her cheeks. The man walked away, his steps echoing harshly against the pavement. Elaine swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to let tears blur her vision. She looked down at her guitar case, where a few coins glinted faintly in the morning light. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Taking a deep breath, she resumed singing, her voice steadier this time. The child from earlier was still watching, his innocent smile a balm to her wounded pride. Elaine poured everything she had into the next song, her voice soaring above the din of the city. She sang as though her life depended on it, because in many ways it did. As the sun climbed higher, Elaine's throat grew hoarse, and her fingers ached from strumming. She finally stopped, gathering the coins from her guitar case and tucking them into her pocket. The total was disheartening, barely enough for a loaf of bread, but it would have to do. Elaine trudged home, her steps heavy and her heart heavier still. Her neighborhood was a stark contrast to the city square, with its cracked sidewalks and graffiti-covered walls. The small apartment she shared with her family was at the end of a narrow alley, its facade faded and crumbling. When she reached the door, she froze. A bright yellow paper was taped to it, flapping slightly in the breeze. Her stomach sank as she read the words, "Eviction notice." They had until the end of the month. Elaine tore the paper from the door, her hands shaking. She stepped inside, the familiar smell of home greeting her. It wasn't much. A threadbare couch, mismatched furniture, and a kitchen that always seemed to be one appliance away from breaking. But it was theirs. Her mother was sitting on the couch, her frail figure slumped with exhaustion. She looked up as Elaine entered, her eyes clouded with worry. "Did you make anything today?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with hope. Elaine pulled the coins from her pocket, placing them on the table. "It's not much," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's face fell, the weight of their situation pressing down on her like a physical force. "We need more than this, Elaine," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer we can hold on." Elaine nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wanted to reassure her mother, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the words felt hollow. Instead, she went to her brother's room, where the little boy was sprawled on the floor, drawing on a scrap of cardboard. "Did you sing today?" he asked, looking up with a bright smile. Elaine forced a smile, kneeling beside him. "Yeah, I sang," she said, ruffling his hair. "And I'll keep singing. Don't worry." Her brother nodded, satisfied with her answer. He went back to his drawing, his innocent belief in her unwavering. Elaine watched him for a moment, her heart aching. She couldn't let him down. She had to find a way. That night, as she lay on her thin mattress staring at the cracked ceiling, Elaine clutched a photo of her father. It was taken during happier times, when the world felt full of promise. She remembered his voice, steady and reassuring, telling her to follow her dreams no matter what. "I'll figure it out, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise." The moonlight streaming through the window seemed to mock her, its cold glow offering no comfort. Elaine closed her eyes, clutching the photo tightly. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would sing again. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she had to try. Her voice was all she had left, and she wasn't ready to give up on it, or on herself. An unexpected melody. The first rays of dawn seeped through the curtains as Elaine stirred on her thin mattress, the stiff springs beneath her groaning with her every movement. The faint aroma of day-old bread wafted in from the kitchen, a grim reminder of their dwindling food supply. Elaine rubbed her eyes and glanced toward her brother, still asleep on his small cot, clutching a worn teddy bear to his chest. She envied his peaceful slumber, the innocence that shielded him from the harsh realities she couldn't escape. Her mother was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her head resting on her hands. A steaming cup of tea sat untouched in front of her. Elaine's footsteps were soft as she entered the kitchen, but her mother didn't look up. The lines on her face seemed deeper in the morning light, her eyes fixed on the eviction notice Elaine had brought back the day before. "Morning," Elaine said softly, breaking the silence. Her mother glanced up, her tired eyes meeting Elaine's. "Morning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you sleep?" Elaine nodded, though they both knew it wasn't true. She poured herself a glass of water, the cold liquid doing little to soothe the dryness in her throat. "I'm going out to sing again today," Elaine said, her voice firm. Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "Elaine, I don't know how much longer you can keep doing this. It's not enough. We need real money." Elaine felt her chest tighten. She knew her mother's words came from a place of love and desperation, but they stung nonetheless. "Singing is all I have, Mom. I can't just stop." Her mother looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "I know you're trying, sweetheart. Just be careful out there." Elaine kissed her mother's cheek and grabbed her guitar case. She paused at the door, glancing back at the small, dimly lit apartment, her brother's drawing from the day before. A crude but heartfelt depiction of her singing on a grand stage was taped to the fridge. It made her smile, even as tears threatened to spill. She had to keep going, for him and for herself. The city was waking up slowly, the streets still quiet save for the occasional sound of a passing car or the rustling of leaves in the crisp autumn breeze. Elaine made her way to her usual spot near the metro station, her steps purposeful but heavy. She could feel the weight of her family's struggles pressing down on her shoulders. Every note she sang today had to count. When she arrived, she was surprised to find the square emptier than usual. The usual vendors hadn't yet set up their stalls, and the familiar hum of the city felt subdued. Elaine set down her guitar case and pulled out her instrument, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the wood. She tuned it carefully, each pluck of the strings grounding her in the moment. She took a deep breath and began to sing. Her voice started soft, carrying a melancholy tune that seemed to echo in the empty square. The lyrics were new, words she had scribbled in a notebook the night before when sleep had evaded her. They spoke of longing, of resilience, and of the quiet hope that refused to be extinguished, no matter how dark the night. As her voice grew stronger, the square began to come alive. A few early commuters stopped to listen, their hurried strides slowing as they turned toward the sound. Elaine kept her eyes closed, letting the music flow through her. She didn't sing for the crowd. She sang for herself, for her brother, for her father's memory. When she finished the song, a smattering of applause broke out. Elaine opened her eyes, startled to find a small group of people gathered around her. A few of them dropped coins into her guitar case, their smiles encouraging. She nodded her thanks, her cheeks flushing with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Among the small crowd, one figure stood out. A man in a tailored suit and a long black coat leaned against a lamppost, his arms crossed as he watched her intently. His face was unreadable, but his presence was commanding. Elaine felt a prickle of unease, but forced herself to focus on her next song. She launched into a lively tune, the upbeat melody a stark contrast to the weight in her chest. Her fingers danced over the guitar strings, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm. More people stopped to listen, some clapping along, others swaying to the music. For a brief moment, Elaine felt like she was where she belonged, her worries melting away under the warmth of the crowd's appreciation. When she finished, the man in the suit stepped forward. Elaine's heart skipped a beat as he approached, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He stopped a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. "That was remarkable," he said, his voice smooth and deep. Elaine blinked, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she said cautiously. The man smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you perform here often?" Elaine hesitated, glancing at her guitar case. "Most days," she admitted. "It's the only place I can." The man nodded, his gaze lingering on her guitar. "You have a gift," he said. "Raw, unpolished, but undeniably powerful. I could hear it in your voice." Elaine felt a flush of both pride and suspicion. Compliments like this didn't come often, and she had learned to be wary of them. "Thank you," she said again, her voice more guarded this time. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. "My name is Victor Hayes. I'm a music producer, and I'm always on the lookout for talent. I think you might be what I'm looking for." Elaine stared at the card, her heart pounding. She had heard of Victor Hayes before. He was a well-known name in the industry, someone who had launched the careers of several successful artists. But she also knew the stories, the whispers of false promises and exploitation that often accompanied opportunities like this. I don't know," she stammered, not taking the card. Victor tilted his head, his smile softening. "I understand your hesitation, but I'm not here to take advantage of you. I want to help you. If you're interested, come to my studio tomorrow. No strings attached, just a chance to see what we can do together." He placed the card on top of her guitar case and turned to leave. "Think about it," he said over his shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. Elaine stared at the card, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, fear, and disbelief. Was this the break she had been waiting for? Or was it too good to be true? She had no answers, only questions that gnawed at her as she packed up her things and headed home. That evening, Elaine sat at the kitchen table, turning the card over in her hands. Her mother was folding laundry nearby, her movements slow and methodical. Elaine hadn't told her about Victor Hayes. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. Not yet. Her brother ran into the room, clutching a new drawing. "Elaine, look," he said excitedly, holding up a picture of her standing on a stage with a spotlight shining down on her. Elaine smiled, her heart aching with both love and doubt. "It's beautiful, buddy," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Are you going to sing tomorrow?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Elaine glanced at the card on the table. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I am." Her brother beamed, and for a moment, the weight on Elaine's shoulders felt just a little lighter. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she had to try. For her brother, for her family, and for herself. No matter how terrifying the unknown, the thought of not trying was even more so. Tomorrow, she would face Victor Hayes and see if her voice could carry her somewhere new. The first step toward the spotlight. Elaine awoke before dawn, the world outside her window still cloaked in shadows. The faint hum of city life hadn't yet stirred, and for a moment, she let herself revel in the rare silence. Today, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Cautious hope. As she lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, her thoughts were filled with Victor Hayes' business card, which still sat on the kitchen table. Slipping out of bed quietly to avoid waking her little brother, Elaine stretched and made her way to the kitchen. The card glinted faintly under the weak morning light filtering through the window. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the embossed letters again. Victor Hayes, producer, Avalon Music Studios. Her mother was seated at the table, a cup of tea in her hands. The dark circles under her eyes seemed deeper today, a testament to another sleepless night. She looked up as Elaine entered, her expression a mix of worry and exhaustion. "Morning, sweetheart," her mother said softly, her voice carrying the weight of their shared burdens. "What's on your mind?" Elaine hesitated, unsure how to explain. Her mother had always been wary of dreams that seemed too good to be true, especially after Elaine's father had chased his own and left the family in financial ruin before passing away. Still, she had to say something. "Mom," Elaine began, her voice unsteady. "Yesterday, I met someone, a music producer. He said he wanted to help me. He gave me his card." Her mother's brows furrowed, and she set her cup down carefully. "A producer?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "And what exactly did he say?" Elaine held up the card, her voice gaining strength as she recounted the encounter. "He said I have potential, and that I should come to his studio. He didn't ask for money or anything. He just wants to hear me sing." Her mother sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "Elaine, you know how these things go. People make promises, and most of the time, they're just empty words. What if this is just another letdown?" Elaine nodded, understanding her mother's concern. "I know, Mom. I thought the same thing. But what if it's not? What if this is my chance to actually do something with my voice? To help us?" Her mother stared at her for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "I just don't want to see you get hurt, Elaine. You've already been through so much." "I know, Mom," Elaine said, her voice firm. "But I have to try. If I don't, I'll always wonder what could have been." Her mother sighed again, but finally nodded. "All right. Just be careful, okay?" By mid-morning, Elaine stood outside Avalon Music Studios, her heart pounding against her ribs. The building was sleek and modern, with reflective glass panels that made it seem like it belonged in another world, one far removed from the worn-down streets she called home. She clutched her guitar case tightly, her palms sweaty despite the cool autumn air. Taking a deep breath, Elaine pushed open the glass doors and stepped inside. The lobby was pristine, with polished marble floors and minimalist decor. A young woman with a headset sat behind the reception desk, typing away on a computer. She looked up as Elaine approached. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but brisk. "I'm here to see Victor Hayes," Elaine said, her voice wavering slightly. The receptionist's gaze flicked to the guitar case in Elaine's hand, and her expression softened. "Oh, you must be Elaine," she said, offering a small smile. "Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Follow me." Elaine followed the receptionist down a long hallway, her nerves building with each step. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of successful artists, their bright smiles and polished appearances a stark contrast to Elaine's own reflection in the glass. She felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world. The receptionist stopped outside a door and knocked lightly before opening it. "Mr. Hayes, Elaine is here," she announced. Victor Hayes looked up from the desk where he was reviewing some papers. He smiled warmly when he saw Elaine. "Elaine, I'm glad you decided to come," he said, standing to greet her. Elaine managed a small smile as she stepped into the room. It was a cozy space, with plush chairs and a large window that let in natural light. A grand piano sat in the corner, its polished surface gleaming. "Have a seat," Victor said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'm excited to hear you sing again. I've arranged for a quick audition. Nothing formal, just you, me, and a few of my colleagues." Elaine's stomach churned at the mention of an audition. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it made her nerves spike. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor seemed to sense her anxiety and leaned forward, his tone reassuring. "Elaine, you don't need to worry. This is just to get a feel for your voice. Take your time, and just be yourself." Elaine nodded, gripping her guitar case tighter. "All right," she said, trying to steady her breathing. Victor led her to a small recording studio down the hall. The space was dimly lit, with soundproof walls and an array of high-tech equipment. 3 people were seated behind the glass panel, their expressions curious but kind. "Whenever you're ready," Victor said, stepping aside to give her space. Elaine took a deep breath and set her guitar case on the floor. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder and positioned herself in front of the microphone. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the strings. Closing her eyes, Elaine began to sing. The first note was shaky, her nerves getting the better of her, but she pushed through. The melody she had written just days ago spilled from her lips, each word carrying a piece of her soul. She sang about struggle, about loss, but also about the stubborn flicker of hope that refused to die. As she continued, her voice grew stronger, her confidence building with each note. The world outside the studio faded away, and for a few minutes, there was only the music. Elaine poured everything she had into the song, letting the rawness of her emotions shine through. When she finished, the room was silent. Elaine opened her eyes, her chest heaving. The 3 people behind the glass exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Victor stepped into the room, his face lit with a wide smile. "That," he said, his voice brimming with excitement, "was incredible." Elaine blinked, her heart leaping in her chest. "Really?" Victor nodded. "Absolutely. Your voice is raw and unpolished, but it's real. And that's what people connect with. I'd like to work with you, Elaine. We can refine your talent, record some demos, and see where it takes us." Elaine felt a rush of emotions, relief, joy, and disbelief all at once. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Say yes," Victor said with a grin. "We'll start small and take it one step at a time." Elaine nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." As she left the studio later that day, a new sense of purpose filled her heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed a little brighter. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she was ready to find out. Trials in the studio. Elaine's hands trembled as she clutched the folder Victor had given her. It was a simple packet. Documents to review, studio rules, and a small sheet with a proposed schedule for recording sessions. But to Elaine, it might as well have been a ticket to a new world. She had spent the bus ride home reading and rereading the papers, her mind racing with possibilities. Yet as the city blurred past the window, doubt began to creep in. She stepped off the bus in her familiar neighborhood, the stark contrast between the gleaming studio and the crumbling streets she called home weighing heavily on her. The buildings leaned inward as if conspiring to keep her dreams contained within their tired facades. Elaine adjusted her guitar case over her shoulder and walked briskly toward her apartment, rehearsing how she would explain this opportunity to her mother. The smell of something burning greeted her as she entered the apartment. Her mother stood over the stove, fanning the smoke rising from a pan. Elaine dropped her things by the door and rushed over. "Mom, what happened?" she asked, coughing as the acrid smell filled her lungs. Her mother waved her off, her tone sharp with frustration. "It's nothing. The stove's acting up again. I'm fine." Elaine grabbed a towel and helped clear the smoke. Once the air settled, she turned to her mother, who was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. "Mom, I have something to tell you," Elaine said cautiously, taking a seat across from her. Her mother looked up, her tired eyes meeting Elaine's. "What is it?" Elaine hesitated, clutching the folder in her lap. "Victor Hayes, the producer I told you about. He wants to work with me. He thinks I have potential, and he's offering me studio time to record some demos." Her mother's expression didn't change. She studied Elaine for a long moment before speaking. "And what does he expect in return?" "Nothing," Elaine said quickly. "He just wants to help me get my foot in the door. He said we'd take it slow, one step at a time." Her mother sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Elaine, I want to believe this is real. I really do. But I've seen what happens when people chase dreams like this. Your father." Her voice broke, and she looked away. "I just don't want you to get hurt." Elaine reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. "Mom, I understand. But I have to try. For you, for my brother, for all of us. I can't keep singing on the streets forever." Her mother's gaze softened, and she squeezed Elaine's hand. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Elaine said, her voice firm. "I promise." The next morning, Elaine arrived at Avalon Music Studios for her first session. Victor greeted her with his usual warm smile, but the energy in the studio was different today. Technicians bustled around, adjusting microphones and soundboards, while other artists wandered in and out of recording booths. Elaine felt a pang of intimidation as she observed the polished professionals around her. They all looked so confident, so at home in this space. "Come on, I'll show you your booth," Victor said, leading her down the hallway. They stopped in front of a small recording room, its walls padded with soundproof foam. Inside, a sleek microphone stood waiting, flanked by a stool and a music stand. "This is where the magic happens," Victor said with a grin. "Don't worry if it feels overwhelming at first. We're just going to lay down a few tracks today, get a feel for your voice." Elaine nodded, swallowing hard. She stepped into the booth, her hands trembling as she adjusted the guitar strap over her shoulder. The glass window separating her from the control room felt like a barrier, amplifying her nerves. Victor's encouraging thumbs up from the other side did little to calm her. The first song was one she had written herself, a haunting melody about loss and resilience. As she began to sing, the familiarity of the lyrics grounded her. But the sterile environment of the studio was nothing like the street corner where she was used to performing. There were no bustling crowds or clinking coins to mask her imperfections. Every note, every breath was laid bare. Halfway through the song, Victor's voice crackled through the headphones. "Elaine, you've got a beautiful tone, but you're holding back. Let's try that chorus again, and this time, don't be afraid to really go for it." Elaine took a deep breath, closing her eyes to block out the intimidating equipment. She thought of her brother's drawings, of her father's voice urging her to keep singing. When she sang the chorus again, her voice soared, raw and unfiltered. Victor's satisfied nod through the glass was all the encouragement she needed. By the end of the session, Elaine was exhausted. Her throat was raw, and her fingers ached from hours of playing. Yet she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. Victor met her in the hallway as she was packing up her things. "You did great today," he said. "There's still work to be done, but you've got something special, Elaine. I can feel it." "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but grateful. Victor hesitated, then added, "I want you to meet someone. He's one of our top vocal coaches, and I think he can help you take your voice to the next level." Elaine's heart raced. A vocal coach. The idea both excited and terrified her. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Victor said. "Same time." Elaine nodded, her mind spinning with possibilities. That evening, Elaine returned home to a quiet apartment. Her brother was drawing at the kitchen table, his crayon spread out like a rainbow. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting up. "Elaine, did you sing today?" "I did," she said, ruffling his hair. "And guess what? They liked it." Her brother beamed, holding up a new drawing. This one showed Elaine standing on a stage, a crowd of stick figures cheering beneath her. Tears stung her eyes as she took the drawing, the innocence of his belief in her filling her with renewed determination. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her expression soft. "How did it go?" she asked. "It was different," Elaine admitted. "Harder than I expected. But I think I can do this, Mom. I really think I can." Her mother nodded, a small smile breaking through her weariness. "Then keep going, Elaine. If you believe in this, then I'll believe in you." The next day, Elaine arrived at the studio early, her nerves already on edge. Victor introduced her to the vocal coach, a tall, wiry man named James, with sharp eyes and an intense demeanor. "All right, Elaine," James said, his voice brisk. "Let's hear what you've got." Elaine sang one of her original songs, her voice trembling slightly under James's scrutiny. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You've got raw talent," he said, "but your technique needs work. If you want to survive in this industry, you have to refine your voice, build your stamina, and learn to command a room." Elaine nodded, her determination outweighing her fear. "I'm ready to learn." For the next hour, James put her through a series of vocal exercises that pushed her to her limits. By the end, her throat burned, and she felt like she'd been run over by a truck. But she also felt stronger, more in control of her voice than ever before. Victor checked in midway through the session, his smile widening as he watched Elaine's progress. "She's a quick learner," James said. "If she keeps this up, she'll be unstoppable." Elaine left the studio that day exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, she felt like her dreams were within reach. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she was ready to walk it, one step, one note, at a time. Rising from the shadows, the following weeks were a whirlwind for Elaine, filled with long hours in the studio and even longer nights practicing in her cramped bedroom. Each morning, she woke up sore from vocal exercises and with calloused fingers from endless hours of strumming her guitar. Yet she never complained. This was what she had fought for, an opportunity to rise above the suffocating confines of her circumstances. Her mother had grown cautiously optimistic. She didn't always voice her support, but Elaine noticed how her eyes softened when she spoke about the studio. Her little brother, on the other hand, had become her biggest cheerleader. Every day, he waited eagerly for her to return home, peppering her with questions about the studio and proudly showing her his latest drawings of her as a superstar. Elaine clung to their belief in her like a lifeline, but the pressure was mounting. Victor had set a deadline for her first demo. The studio wasn't a charity, and while he believed in her potential, he made it clear that results mattered. "This is your chance to show people who you are, Elaine," he had said during one session. "The world doesn't wait for anyone. You need to grab this moment and make it yours." One afternoon, Elaine arrived at the studio to find Victor waiting for her in the control room. His usually warm demeanor was tinged with seriousness, and beside him stood a woman Elaine hadn't met before. She was impeccably dressed, with sharp features and an air of authority that made Elaine's stomach twist. "Elaine," Victor began, gesturing toward the woman. "This is Margaret. She's one of the best marketing consultants in the business. She wants to help us craft your image." "My image?" Elaine echoed, confusion flickering across her face. Margaret smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Yes, dear. Talent is only part of the equation in this industry. People don't just buy music. They buy a story, a persona. We need to make you memorable. Elaine felt a pang of unease. She had spent her life trying to be heard, not seen. The thought of being molded into someone she wasn't made her stomach churn. What exactly do you mean by that? She asked cautiously. Margaret stepped closer, studying Elaine with a critical eye. You've got a raw, authentic charm, but it needs refinement. The torn jeans, the guitar, that's a start. But we need to polish it. Give you an edge that stands out in a crowded market. Elaine glanced at Victor, searching his face for reassurance. Do I really need to change? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Victor hesitated before answering. Not change, Elaine. Just amplify who you already are. Margaret is here to help you find the best version of yourself, the one the world will fall in love with. Elaine nodded slowly, though her heart remained heavy. She had fought so hard to find her voice, and now it felt like she was being asked to mold it into something else. Still, she couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. Not when her family was counting on her. Over the next few days, Elaine worked closely with Margaret, who pushed her out of her comfort zone at every turn. They experimented with different styles of clothing, makeup, and even stage presence. Margaret was relentless, her critiques often harsh but always constructive. You're too stiff, she said during one practice session. Loosen up. Let the audience feel your energy. Elaine gritted her teeth, nodding as she adjusted her stance. I'll try again. She hated how awkward she felt under Margaret's scrutiny, but she refused to give up. If this was what it took to make her voice heard, then so be it. Meanwhile, the studio sessions grew more intense. Victor brought in professional musicians to accompany Elaine on her tracks, adding depth and complexity to her simple melodies. James, her vocal coach, continued to push her limits, demanding perfection with every note. One evening, after hours of recording, Victor pulled her aside. Elaine, I need to talk to you about something important. She tensed, bracing herself for bad news. What is it? Victor ran a hand through his hair, his expression serious. Your story is powerful. Your voice is incredible. But you need a signature song, something that defines you and sets you apart. I've been listening to your originals, and while they're good, they don't quite hit the mark. Elaine felt a pang of disappointment but nodded. What do you want me to do? I want you to write something new, Victor said. Dig deep. Think about everything you've been through. Your struggles, your dreams, your family. Write the song that only you can write. That night, Elaine sat in her bedroom with her guitar resting on her lap. Her little brother was fast asleep, and her mother's soft snores drifted from the other room. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Elaine stared at the blank page in her notebook, her pen hovering above it. She thought about her father and the promise she had made to him. She thought about her mother's tired eyes and her brother's unwavering belief in her. She thought about the eviction notice still pinned to the fridge, a grim reminder of how much was at stake. Closing her eyes, she let the emotions wash over her. When she began to strum her guitar, the melody came first, soft and haunting, like a whisper in the dark. Then the words followed, spilling out of her like a flood. They spoke of pain and resilience, of a girl who refused to be silenced, and of a hope that burned brighter than any darkness. Elaine lost track of time as she wrote, her pen moving furiously across the page. By the time she finished, the first light of dawn was creeping through the window. She stared at the lyrics, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the song that would tell her story. At her next studio session, Elaine handed Victor the crumpled piece of paper. I wrote something, she said, her voice trembling. I think this is the one. Victor scanned the lyrics, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at Elaine, a slow smile spreading across his face. This is incredible, he said. We're recording this today. The session that followed was unlike anything Elaine had experienced before. The room buzzed with energy as Victor and the musicians worked to bring her song to life. When Elaine stepped into the booth to record her vocals, she felt a surge of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. As she sang, her voice filled the room, carrying every ounce of emotion she had poured into the lyrics. The song was raw and powerful, a testament to her journey. When she finished, the control room erupted in applause. Victor beamed at her through the glass. "That," he said, "is going to change everything." When Elaine left the studio that evening, she felt lighter than she had in months. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she believed she could shape it on her own terms. The song she had written was more than music. It was her story, her truth, and now it was ready to be heard. A star emerges. The sun had barely risen, but Elaine was already awake, pacing her small apartment. Her guitar leaned against the wall, and on the table lay a CD case, the first demo of her original song. It had been 2 weeks since the recording session, and today was the day Victor planned to debut the track at a private industry event. He had called it the launch pad for her career. Elaine, however, was a bundle of nerves. Her mother watched her from the kitchen, a faint smile on her face. "Elaine, you're going to wear a hole in the floor," she said, placing a steaming cup of tea on the table. Elaine stopped pacing and sighed, sitting down heavily. "I'm just scared, Mom. What if they don't like it? What if?" Her mother cut her off with a gentle but firm tone. "Stop. You've worked so hard for this. You've poured your heart into that song. No matter what happens today, you've already accomplished something incredible." Elaine looked at her mother, her throat tightening with emotion. "Thanks, Mom. I want this to work. For us." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed Elaine's hand. "It will. You've got more strength than you realize. Now go out there and show them who you are." The event was being held at a trendy downtown venue. When Elaine arrived, her breath caught in her throat. The place was a far cry from the worn streets she was used to. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and a room buzzed with the low hum of conversation as industry professionals mingled. Musicians, producers, and talent scouts filled the space, their polished appearances making Elaine feel out of place in her simple dress and boots. Victor greeted her at the entrance, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Elaine, you made it. Are you ready?" "I think so," she said, trying to steady her voice. Victor gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Good. Just remember, tonight isn't about impressing everyone. It's about connecting with the right people, people who will see what I see in you." Elaine nodded, though her nerves still churned in her stomach. Victor led her through the crowd, introducing her to a handful of key figures. Most were polite but distracted, their attention flitting from one conversation to the next. Elaine felt like a small fish in an ocean of sharks. As the evening progressed, Victor took the stage to introduce her. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him as he tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. I have someone very special to share with you, a rising talent whose voice I believe will leave a lasting impact." Elaine's heart raced as Victor gestured for her to join him. She stepped onto the stage, her legs trembling beneath her. The spotlight felt blinding, and the weight of so many expectant gazes threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of her brother's drawings, of her mother's faith in her, and of her father's memory. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "This song is about my journey, about finding hope in the darkest places and holding on when it feels impossible." Victor pressed play, and the opening chords of her song filled the room. Elaine closed her eyes as her recorded voice echoed through the speakers. The raw emotion of the lyrics resonated in a way she hadn't fully realized before. As the song built to its powerful chorus, she opened her eyes to see the audience. Many of them were captivated, their conversations halted, their eyes fixed on her. When the final note faded, the room was silent for a beat before erupting into applause. Elaine's cheeks flushed, and her chest felt tight with a mix of relief and joy. Victor stepped forward, grinning. "That," he said into the microphone, "is the sound of authenticity. Remember her name. Elaine is just getting started." After the performance, people approached Elaine, their faces alight with enthusiasm. A talent scout from a major label complimented her voice, calling it soulful and unforgettable. A producer offered to collaborate on future tracks. Margaret, the marketing consultant, hovered nearby, clearly pleased with the reception. Elaine, overwhelmed but grateful, accepted their praise with humility. "Thank you," she said over and over, her voice almost drowned out by the buzz of the crowd. Victor pulled her aside as the night wound down, his expression triumphant. "You did it, Elaine. That was exactly what we needed to make people take notice." Elaine nodded, still trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. "It doesn't feel real." Victor chuckled. "Get used to it. This is just the beginning." The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and planning sessions. Victor's phone rang constantly with inquiries about Elaine. She was offered a small contract with an independent label, which Victor assured her was the perfect stepping stone. "They'll give you the creative freedom to develop your sound while providing the support you need," he explained. Elaine signed the contract with trembling hands, her mind racing with possibilities. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar deal, but it was enough to get her started, and enough to help her family. The first advance check would cover their overdue rent and then some. That evening, Elaine returned home and handed the check to her mother. Her mother's eyes widened as she looked at the amount, tears welling up. "Elaine, this is incredible," her mother said, her voice breaking. "You've done so much for us." Elaine hugged her tightly. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You kept us going when things felt impossible." Her little brother bounded into the room, clutching one of his drawings. "Did they love your song, Elaine?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "They did," Elaine said, kneeling to hug him. "And it's because you believed in me." Over the next few months, Elaine's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. Her song was released digitally, and while it didn't become an overnight sensation, it gained a loyal following. Fans began to reach out, sharing how her lyrics had touched them and given them hope. Elaine realized that her voice had the power to connect with people, to make them feel less alone. She continued to write, pouring her experiences into her music. Each song was a reflection of her journey, her struggles, her dreams, and the unshakable belief that had carried her through. The more she shared, the more her audience grew. Victor remained by her side, guiding her with a steady hand. "You've got something rare, Elaine," he said during one studio session. "You're not just a singer, you're a storyteller. And people need to hear your story." One night, Elaine stood backstage at a small concert venue, her heart pounding as the crowd outside chanted her name. It was her first headlining show, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. She clutched her guitar, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage, greeted by a sea of cheering faces. The lights were blinding, but the warmth of the audience enveloped her. She strummed the first chord, her voice steady and strong as she began to sing. As the music flowed, Elaine felt a profound sense of belonging. This was where she was meant to be, not just singing, but connecting, inspiring, and reminding others that even in the darkest moments, hope could still shine through. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, Elaine believed in herself. And as the crowd sang along to her lyrics, their voices blending with hers, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they were writing a new story, one filled with resilience, passion, and the enduring power of a single voice. The turning point. The applause thundered through the small venue, reverberating in Elaine's chest as she finished her final song of the night. She stood under the glaring stage lights, her guitar hanging loosely at her side, as the crowd continued to cheer. It was surreal. Less than a year ago, she had been singing on the street corner, ignored by the world. Now dozens of strangers were on their feet, calling her name. She stepped off the stage to a flood of congratulations from the crew and Victor, whose face was lit with pride. You owned that stage, Elaine. Did you see their faces? You connected with them, every single one of them. Elaine smiled, though she was still catching her breath. It didn't feel real until tonight, Victor. Like maybe I could actually belong here. Victor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't just belong. You're carving out your own place. Now let's get you ready for the next step. Elaine raised an eyebrow. Next step. Tonight felt like a mountain already. Victor chuckled. It's not just about one night, Elaine. This is about momentum. The more people hear your music, the more they'll connect with your story. I've got some ideas for what comes next. Elaine nodded, though her exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her. She glanced out at the lingering crowd, people still milling about, talking about her performance. A few fans were holding up makeshift signs with her name on them, and the sight tugged at her heart. These were people who believed in her, who saw her for who she was. In the days that followed, Victor's next step became clear. The buzz from Elaine's performance had reached beyond the small venue, catching the attention of a mid-sized record label. They wanted to meet with her to discuss a potential distribution deal for her demo, which had begun to gain traction on streaming platforms. Elaine sat across from Victor in the studio's lounge, the excitement in the air palpable. This could be huge for you, Elaine, Victor said, sliding a contract across the table. They're offering national distribution, promotional support, and a modest advance for your next project. Elaine picked up the contract, her eyes scanning the dense text. It was overwhelming, the language formal and unfamiliar. She felt a twinge of doubt as she looked up at Victor. This feels big, bigger than I imagined. Are you sure I'm ready for this? Victor leaned forward, his expression serious. You're more than ready, but you don't have to decide right now. Take this home, review it with someone you trust. Just know that opportunities like this don't come around every day. That evening, Elaine sat at the kitchen table with the contract spread out in front of her. Her mother sat across from her, her brow furrowed as she read through the terms. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional sound of her little brother humming in the next room. This sounds like a real opportunity, her mother said finally, setting the papers down. But it also sounds like a big commitment. Are you sure this is what you want? Elaine looked at her mother, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I think so, Mom. I mean, this is what I've been working for. But it's scary, you know. What if I mess up? What if I can't handle it? Her mother reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over Elaine's. Sweetheart, you've faced so much already. You've fought for every inch of this. If anyone can handle this, it's you. Elaine smiled, gripping her phone tightly. That's amazing. I still can't believe it. You'd better start believing it, Victor said with a chuckle. But we can't lose momentum. I've lined up a meeting with a major label rep tomorrow. They're interested in signing you for an album deal. An album. Elaine's voice caught in her throat. She had dreamed of this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel enormous. Intimidating. Yes, an album, Victor said. And not just that. They're talking about a small tour to promote it. This could take you to the next level. Elaine agreed to the meeting, though the idea of an album and a tour filled her with equal parts excitement and anxiety. She hung up and stared at the ceiling, trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Everything was changing so fast, and she wasn't sure she was ready for all of it. The meeting with the record label was held in an office that oozed sophistication. The executives, dressed in tailored suits, greeted her warmly, but with an air of professionalism that reminded her this was business, not just passion. They praised her performance at the showcase and the authenticity of her music, emphasizing how much the industry was yearning for real voices. One executive, a woman named Claudia, slid a glossy folder across the table. This is what we're proposing. a 10-track debut album, full promotional support, and a 6-city tour. We believe you have what it takes to resonate with a broad audience. Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. The terms were clear but overwhelming. She glanced at Victor, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Take your time," he said softly. "I appreciate this opportunity," Elaine said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I just want to make sure my music stays true to who I am. That's really important to me." Claudia smiled, leaning forward. "That's exactly what we want too. Your authenticity is your greatest strength, and we're here to amplify that, not change it." Elaine left the meeting with a copy of the contract and Victor's assurance that they'd review every detail together. "Don't rush this," he advised. "It's a big step, and we need to make sure it's right." Back at home, Elaine spread the contract across the kitchen table, where her mother joined her. Her brother peeked over her shoulder, his wide eyes scanning the pages as if he could understand the legal jargon. "What does this mean?" he asked, pointing at the bold text at the top of the document. "It means I might be making an album," Elaine said, ruffling his hair. "A real one." Her mother sat quietly for a moment, then looked at Elaine with a mixture of pride and concern. "This is a big responsibility, Elaine. Are you sure you're ready?" Elaine hesitated, her gaze dropping to the papers in front of her. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I've worked so hard for this. I can't stop now." Her mother reached across the table, taking Elaine's hand in hers. "Then we'll figure it out together. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." Elaine signed the contract a week later, and the whirlwind truly began. The label paired her with an experienced producer, a gruff but brilliant man named Marcus, who had worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. Their first session together was intense. Marcus was exacting, stopping her mid-song to adjust her delivery or tweak the arrangement. "Your voice is raw, and that's great," he said, his tone firm but encouraging. "But raw doesn't mean sloppy. Every note has to mean something." At first, Elaine found his approach daunting, but over time, she began to appreciate his attention to detail. Under his guidance, her songs evolved into something more polished without losing their authenticity. The studio became her second home, and while the hours were grueling, she found herself thriving in the creative process. As work on the album progressed, Elaine was also preparing for her first tour. The label had arranged a series of small but impactful shows in intimate venues, designed to build her fan base organically. The thought of traveling to new cities thrilled her, but it also meant leaving her family behind for weeks at a time. On the eve of her departure, Elaine sat in her brother's room, helping him with a drawing. He had insisted on creating a tour map with tiny illustrations of each city she would visit. "Are you scared?" he asked, his voice small. "A little," Elaine admitted, "but I'm also excited. It's a big adventure." He nodded, his expression serious. "You'll do great. You always do." His words stayed with her as she boarded the tour bus the next morning, waving goodbye to her family. The bus was modest, shared with her band and crew, but to Elaine, it felt like a ticket to a new chapter of her life. Elaine smiled, though her chest still felt tight. "It just feels like everything is happening so fast. A year ago, I was singing on the street corner. Now I'm sitting here with a record deal in front of me." Her mother squeezed her hand. "That's because you've earned it. Don't let fear hold you back." The next morning, Elaine returned to the studio with the signed contract in hand. Victor greeted her with an approving nod, his confidence in her unwavering. "You've made the right choice," he said. "Now the real work begins." Over the next few months, Elaine's life became a blur of writing, recording, and performing. The label helped her refine her sound, pairing her with experienced producers who pushed her to explore new musical styles. At first, she struggled with the pressure of working in a professional environment, where every note was scrutinized and every lyric dissected. But with each session, she grew more confident in her abilities. Her first single, Unbroken, was released nationwide, accompanied by a simple but striking music video that showcased Elaine's authenticity. The song, a stripped-down ballad about perseverance and hope, quickly gained traction on streaming platforms. Fans connected with her heartfelt lyrics and soulful voice, and soon, Elaine found herself fielding invitations to perform on local radio shows and small television segments. One day, Elaine received a call that would change everything. Victor's voice was unusually excited as he relayed the news. "You've been invited to perform at the Rising Stars Showcase." Elaine froze. The showcase was a major industry event, attended by top executives, journalists, and established artists. It was a chance for up-and-coming talent to make a lasting impression, and it was exactly the kind of opportunity Elaine had dreamed of. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dead serious," Victor replied. "They want you to close the night." The weight of the opportunity hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just another performance. This was her chance to prove that she belonged on the big stage. The weeks leading up to the showcase were grueling. Elaine rehearsed tirelessly, fine-tuning every aspect of her performance. She worked closely with her vocal coach, James, and Margaret, who helped her craft a look and stage presence that felt true to her identity. When the night of the showcase arrived, Elaine stood backstage, her heart pounding as she listened to the applause for the performer before her. Victor appeared by her side, his expression calm but encouraging. "You've got this," he said. "Remember, they're here to see you. Just be yourself." Elaine nodded, taking a deep breath. As the announcer introduced her, she stepped onto the stage, greeted by a blinding wall of lights and the hum of anticipation from the crowd. The first few notes of her song filled the air, and Elaine began to sing. Her voice was steady, her confidence growing with each line. The audience was silent, their attention fully on her. By the time she reached the chorus, a wave of emotion washed over her. This was her moment, a culmination of every struggle, every sleepless night, every ounce of hope she had clung to. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Elaine stood there, breathless and overwhelmed, as the crowd rose to their feet. Among them, she spotted her mother and brother, their faces beaming with pride. After the performance, Elaine was approached by several high-profile executives, all eager to discuss potential collaborations. Victor stood nearby, watching with a satisfied smile as Elaine navigated the conversations with grace. That night, as she lay in bed, Elaine reflected on how far she had come. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had shaped her into the artist and the person she was now. For the first time, she felt like she was no longer just chasing her dreams. She was living them. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and opportunities alike. But Elaine knew one thing for sure. Her voice had found its place in the world, and she wasn't going to let it go silent ever again. The climb to stardom. Elaine woke up the morning after the Rising Stars Showcase, feeling an unfamiliar combination of exhilaration and exhaustion. The echoes of applause still rang in her ears, a memory so vivid it almost felt like a dream. She stretched in bed, the sunlight filtering through the curtains warming her face. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to savor the triumph of the previous night. But as her phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, reality quickly caught up. The industry had noticed her. When Elaine answered Victor's call, his excitement was palpable. "Elaine, the buzz is insane. I've got emails, calls, even messages from journalists wanting interviews. You made a splash last night." The tour was a mix of highs and lows. Each city brought new challenges, technical glitches, unpredictable crowds, and the exhaustion of constant travel. But it also brought moments of pure magic. Fans sang along to her songs, their voices blending with hers in a way that made her feel seen and understood. One night, after a particularly emotional performance, a young woman approached her backstage, tears streaming down her face. "Your music saved me," she said, clutching Elaine's hand. "I was in such a dark place, but your lyrics, they gave me hope." Elaine hugged the woman, her own eyes misting with tears. Moments like this reminded her why she had fought so hard to share her voice. It wasn't just about success. It was about connection, about making a difference. By the time the tour ended, Elaine's name was beginning to gain traction in the industry. Her debut album, Unbroken, was released to critical acclaim, praised for its raw emotion and compelling storytelling. The title track, a haunting ballad about resilience, climbed the charts, solidifying Elaine's place as a rising star. Back home, Elaine returned to her family with a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. The apartment felt smaller now, but it was still her sanctuary. Her brother greeted her with a new drawing, this one of her holding a trophy on a big stage. "What's this?" Elaine asked, smiling. "It's for when you win an award," he said matter-of-factly. Elaine laughed, pulling him into a hug. "One step at a time, buddy. One step at a time." Months later, Elaine stood on the stage of a packed arena, the roar of thousands of fans washing over her. Her journey had taken her from the cold streets of her city to this moment, and she knew it was just the beginning. As she strummed the opening chords of her song, she glanced at the front row, where her mother and brother sat, their faces glowing with pride. "This one's for you," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and strong. The crowd erupted in cheers, and as Elaine began to sing, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her climb to stardom hadn't been easy, but every struggle, every sacrifice, had led her here. And she was ready to keep climbing, one note, one lyric, one song at a time.